Thank you, John. You let me have a little warm up the first time. It's all right. I got myself sort of in the mood for it. It's good. I'm Stuart. Um, I'm best described as an anxiety specialist, but I don't really know what that is. Um, I I work with anxiety ultimately, and I have done for the last 25 years. But I say that quietly because if I tell you that, you can probably guess how old I am. Um, I I run an organisation called the Still Method. I'm going to tell you briefly about that. Just I might mention it later, and you'll wonder what it is. But the Still Method is a system that I created to try and help people who are struggling with anxiety. I worked as a social worker originally. Don't hold that against me. And I worked one to one with adults and children with anxiety ever since. And I really was worried about 10 years ago about how young people and adults were struggling with their mental health, struggling with anxiety. And yet the advice they were being given was what I used to call push me, pull you. One person would tell them to go out more, one would tell them to stay in, one would tell them to light a scented candle, one would tell them to write a journal, one would tell them to be grateful, one would tell them to be angry. And it just felt like everyone was being bombarded with advice, but no one was gathering it together in one place to try and help people. So that's what I did. And I wrote a system of kind of support for people that I sometimes say is a bit like IKEA. You follow the instructions, and we're not going to necessarily change the world, but hopefully we're going to start helping you feel a bit better. Touch wood, we've been quite successful with operating in schools and organizations all around the world now. And sometimes it scares me how far we've come in the last 4 years. I'm just waiting to jinx it. So I'm not going to say too much about it. But obviously, there's a few things I want to talk about tonight, and I'm going to try and keep it short. But there's three things really. I want to tell you a little bit about me, just so you know, I haven't rocked up here, that I have got a story to tell. Um, I wanted to tell you a little bit about resilience, because the thing that unites everything I've heard tonight is resilience, really, and why I think that's the superpower that disabled people and actually any person who is struggling has an amazing resource of resilience. And finally, what I want to try and do is give you some of my tips that can help you tap into your resilience, because you are amazing. And I just want to show you how to become even more amazing, if that's possible. So I should probably start by telling you a bit about me. I usually start this by telling you I've broken every bone in my body. It's a lie, but it's a good way to start the conversation, isn't it? I think I worked out I've broken about 90% of the bones in my body at some point, but it's not as good a starter, is it? So I'll say all of them because it's better. Um, but what I'm not going to do is start listing every one of those bones and tell you why it was a terrible, life-changing experience, because I don't think you want to hear that. And actually, I don't think it's going to inspire you or help you in any way, because hopefully you're not going to do that. But what it has taught me is about resilience, how we cope with that thing that Terry mentioned, which I think is really important when we're disabled, that stuff happens. Stuff happens when we're least expecting it. I'm a parent of two daughters. Stuff tends to happen when I least need it. Things happen and they're unpredictable. You're probably familiar with that thing that people sometimes say about fear, and they say it's false evidence appearing real. I don't know if you've heard that. I think that's nonsense, because it's true. Sometimes we're afraid of stuff that isn't going to happen. Sometimes we're frightened that everybody's going to laugh at our terrible haircut, or that we're going to go to work one day and forget our trousers. But usually, when we're afraid of something, it's not about dismissing things. It's actually about it's real. And I'm not here today to tell you that loads of bad, horrible things are going to happen to you, but sometimes they will, and sometimes we live with fear. So what I wanted to talk about is how I've learned to live with that. I think there's two ways to live with unpredictability. And one is to live in denial and live with that toxic positivity of I'm going to be all right. But try telling that to your bank manager when you're running out of money. That positivity doesn't work always. So what can you do? So you can, for me, it's always been about hiding from what scares me or finding a way to face it. And I'm not saying my strategy is right for everyone, but I'm going to talk about what works for me. I learned fairly early on that following people's advice to hide from what scares you is pointless. Well, I mentioned I've got brittle bone disease. When I was 16, a band I really loved were coming to my town, and my parents said to me, "We don't need to go and see them, Stuart, because chances are you're going to break a bone. It's a week before your GCSEs. Stay at home, be careful, and we'll talk about you doing more exciting stuff after your exams." Well, to prove them wrong, I broke both arms the night before my first GCSE, opening a bag of crisps. And I ended up doing my GCSEs with a scribe, and I talked, and that poor woman had to keep up with me and my strange accent. But it taught me early on that desire to protect ourselves from everything and to hide isn't going to work. It's not really going to be the way we move forwards. And what we need to support people to do is do the things they want to do in spite of risk and danger. So I'll tell you a little bit more about me before I jump forwards and tell you about the ways that I think you can find that resilience within yourself. I've got broad bone disease. I was born broken. I was born with broken arms, broken legs, and it kind of continued. People use the expression osteogenesis imperfecta to describe brittle bones. It means bones wrong in the beginning, but I still must be in the beginning because they haven't got any better yet. And what that meant as a child was that I couldn't be picked up. I couldn't play games that my peers played. And I had a very different upbringing to other kids. But it wasn't a bad upbringing. It was just different. And I think I learned very early that life was going to be unpredictable, that things were going to go wrong, like I said, when I least wanted them, when I least needed it. Through adult life, that's continued. I grew to 3 feet tall. If you're struggling to know what a 3 foot tall man looks like, then maybe if you imagine Warwick Davis as a small friend or someone that didn't quite make the mark to be an Oompa Loompa, that would be me. It's a different way of living, but it's not the wrong way of living. And I think that's what I always try and tell people. I remember being a small child and being taken to Great Ormond Street, and somebody came up with this great idea that they would wrap me in an inflatable suit. I would literally be the boy in the bubble. And by putting me in bubble wrap, everything was going to be okay. Nothing bad was going to happen. Fortunately, somebody, I don't know who, saw sense and realized if I was going to make a living as a speaker, cloaking me with bubble wrap wasn't really going to work. So what have I learned? Well, what I've learned and what I encourage my clients to think about is that belief that bad stuff's going to happen and that you can live with it. And the way I do that is I encourage my clients to think of something that we call the worry trap. And the worry trap is how we cope with those worries we can do nothing about, but deal with the ones we can. And I think the problem is that when we worry, we become overwhelmed. We become overwhelmed, and what we tend to do is worry about the wrong things. Socrates, 2,000 years ago, said that people that worry are like people that ride elephants because they think they're in control of that elephant. They think they can tell the elephant where it wants to go, but really it's going to go where the heck it likes. And that's what I feel life is like. It's like riding an elephant. It's going to do what it wants, and you can convince yourself you're okay, but it's not. So the thing I always encourage people I work with to do is to operate what I call a worry trap. And the worry trap is really simple. You make a list of your worries. You ask yourself, can you do anything about them? And you focus on the ones you can. So my example of a worry trap would be a couple of years ago. I'll give you an example of 3 worries. I was sat in my office and I was feeling quite anxious. And I was thinking, well, I'm not really good at advert for what I do. If I'm sat in the office feeling anxious, I need to figure out why. And 3 things were going on for me that day. I had just bought a new car, and I was told I had to drive to Scotland for an event, but the dashboard kept turning off. And every time I took it to the garage, they kept saying to me, there's nothing wrong. And I kept saying, well, there is. So ultimately, I was left with a fairly wonky car. The second thing that was happening was that at the time, I had an 10-year-old daughter who decided it was time to walk on from school. We live in quite a tourist seaside town, and it meant that she would have to cross a road where everybody took their jet skis. So it was a little bit dangerous. And the decision was that what we would do is that when she got to her friend's house on the night, she would text us, and then we would get her across the busy road. Problem was, that first day, the mobile phone was left on the kitchen table. So my worry that day was, is she going to try and come home in a row? And my third worry was that I'd been invited to give a talk to a professional body, a group of my peers, and they'd asked me to talk about what I did. So I had 3 worries that day. I had to write a presentation. I was worried that the car might break down, and I was worried about my daughter. But actually, I only had control of one of those things, didn't I? It was write the presentation. But the worry, the anxiety made me focus on the other things. It made me focus on Felicity's phone. It made me focus on the car not working. What I was falling into is what I call a worry trap. And as disabled people, we have those worries all the time that we're powerless to control. And we can argue whether that's fair or unfair. And obviously it's not fair. But the truth is we've got to find tools that help us. So for me, I would suggest people try what I call the worry trap. They begin to list those worries. They look for the ones they can control. Focus on tackling a little piece of that. There's a saying I always give my clients, and it's, you can't sit comfortable with stones in your pocket. So identify those things you're not doing. Identify those little things that you can take a bite of, and you might begin to feel better about things you can't control. As I say, I'm not going to talk all night because you've had some amazing people speak, and I'm going to just give you one last tip. The final tip I would give people is something that came to mind when Terry was speaking about toxic positivity. And I think we often say to people, it'll be okay. It'll be all right. Oh, it won't be as bad as you think. That thing will be okay. But actually, another great tip that the Romans gave us was something called negative visualization. And it seems really a strange thing to do. But what I advise people to do every morning is when you wake up, sit on the end of your bed and think about what you've got to do today. And think about the things that might go wrong. Think about the people that might disappoint you, the people that might misunderstand what you're trying to do. Think about the big challenge you've got and what if it's not successful. And visualize all those things. Don't hide from them. And then think about what might go right. And by doing that, it seems really odd because it seems like we're thinking really negatively. But actually, we've been honest. We faced it. And then we face a day either filled with good surprises where things go well, but we're forewarned and ready for what's coming. My final tip is if you're into journaling or anything like that, just try and end each day making a point on what went well. Try and just end your day thinking about the 3 things that were successful. For me, sometimes it's something as simple as drinking a cup of coffee before it goes cold, or my daughters being where they told me they were going to be when I went to pick them up. That would be a great achievement. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to hear any more of my nonsense, I post videos every day on Instagram, 1 minute of tips and ideas to help you with anxiety. If you ever want to look at them, you can find that under the Still Method on Instagram. But thank you so much for having me here tonight. I'm absolutely, I feel like I'm up against a tough audience in sharing my story because I've heard some amazing ones. Thank you so much.